on my stuff. He's had a few chances at it. He said a few rushes. So I'm gonna get out of his way. And he's gonna set it up and start.
So the first thing we're going to do when we start to use the car, especially if it's been sitting for a long time, is to use a grease gun and grease all of the points. There is probably 20 or so grease points underneath the car and on top of the car. We won't get it underneath the car today, but when we open up these two doors, you're going to see places to grease pretty much every place. On the shafts, you just grease, on the shaft bearings, there's 4 of them obviously. There are 2 grease points on each bearing. I think it's just a redundant thing in case one got broken or something. So you just pump the grease in until you see grease coming out of the shafts. Everything else is pretty much that way throughout. There's grease points inside the engine and underneath the engine. The only one that doesn't respond to pumping grease in and seeing it come out is on the idler pulley. That was a custom-made pulley by a friend of mine in Texas. He converted a seal bearing to a pump bearing. So just on the idler pulley, why don't we open the 2 doors up now. So on the idler pulley, which is down there, you can see this rod, this lever is connected down to an idler pulley. You have to grease it from underneath. You can see it right there. Just put a couple of squirts of grease into it and forget about it, because if you over grease that, it'll come out and it will get on the belt and then you got troubles. But if you look down, you can't do that with the camera right now, but these levers attach to shafts that need to be greased. All right, so you grease the car up. Next thing you want to do is take a socket wrench and make sure that the engine bolts are snug or tight. Because after someone's run it, nobody's checked them, but you want to make sure the engine nuts are in the front of the engine down by the engine slide. Because if you can see, you can see underneath the engine, there's a place for it to slide out like a drawer. And you just want to make sure that those 2 bolts are tight. So this is a 2-gallon gas tank, and this is 16 ounces of 2-stroke. If you always want to use two-stroke marine oil, and it should say TCW3 certified, TCW3, and almost all of them have a sticker on it right there. So for 2 gallons of gas, you use 1 bottle of this. So it's 1 cup per gallon, 16 to 1. You mix them up in here, you shake it, and then you put 1 ounce of stabilizer in here in case this gas has to stay in here for a long time. Okay, we covered that. So after you mix it up really good, and then you pour it into the gas tank. All right, we're going to check the brake tension. Right now the brakes are set and the car is not moving, so we know at least at the high position it's probably working okay. What's just as important as it braking is that it's not, the brakes go to a free point. So if you looked on where the brake shoes meet the wheels, you want to inspect and make sure that there is some air gap down there, that none of the brakes are dragging. Okay, right now the brake is off, and I'll turn the brake on. And I'll take the brake back off again. So make sure all 4 wheels that they go slack and they go full on. So before we start the engine, and when the engine is still cold, we're going to drain the old gas and oil mixture out of the crank. Some of it stays in there. Most of it goes through the engine and gets fired under the normal operation. But some of it stays inside the crankcase. And so there's a valve underneath the carburetor right up against the crankcase, you open that valve and let the stuff drain out. You can't really see it with the camera, but you can see where my hand's going. It's a little small valve. Let it drain out and then close the valve. I do that. I leave whatever fumes and gas and oil is in the crankcase, leave it there, because why not? It's going to provide vapor to keep the thing from rusting out, and so we drain it then. If you think you have a need to drain it, if you've been driving it all day long and there's hours into it, you've gone through a few spark plugs, it'll need to be drained again. When you stop the car, let it sit for 5 minutes or so. Have someone with a fire extinguisher know where it is at least, because when you open that up, it goes right onto that exhaust pipe. So you want to make sure the exhaust pipe is cool enough that it doesn't set those vapors of the liquid on fire. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to check the fuel water separator. So underneath this tank is the valve that turns the fuel on and off to the carburetor, and also a glass bowl where you can see the glass bowl is there because if there's water in that bowl, you'll see a layer of 2 different liquids. The carburetor has water in it. In other words, you look at the glass bowl and there's 2 different liquids in there. Clearly 2 different liquids. That's water.
How else you can?
I've never seen water in there, to be honest with you, but you can undo the nut that holds the bowl on, pour this stuff out. Be careful when you pull the bowl down. Give it a little turn because it's a cork, natural cork seal. So wiggle the bowl a little bit, don't just yank it off, and see if you can get it to come off with the seal or not break the seal. And if you break the seal, just get a piece of cardboard, thin piece of cardboard, and make your own gasket and stick it back in there. Cardboard will work just fine until you can get a piece of cork. Clean the old stuff off, obviously, first. Anyway, make sure there's no water in there. Inspect the cooling level. So in the front of the machine is a cap, and the engine is cold now. Don't do this when the engine's hot. And you can look in there and see antifreeze. And as long as the antifreeze is somewhere around here, that's okay. Don't overfill it. But if you can't see antifreeze within a couple of inches from the top of this hole, then it needs to add new antifreeze. Never put water in here, because if you start putting water in here, when wintertime comes, you could freeze up the engine, it will break. All right. So we just determined we're starting the engine and that we primed the engine. Unfortunately, the engine's flooded now because we primed it too many times. So the way to clear a flooded engine is to, number 1, remove the spark plug. So that we can spin the engine and get lots of air into it. And then number 2, we're going to take the hand crank and put the hand crank in the engine and just spin it. Oh, I'm going to spin it with the mixture set to 0 all the way down, fully counterclockwise. And that should clear it up. Put the spark plug back in the engine. And the easiest way to ruin this engine is to tighten the spark plug too tight and strip out the threads. So we're always going to, even though I got this great big wrench, we just barely tighten the plug. Never reach out here and push on this thing. Just, that's enough. Just make it snug. Hopefully it'll start. There's another reason that it may not have started. It may be that it's too wet, that the spark plug wire is too wet, but we'll find out. The next thing we're going to do is to make sure that there's gas flow all the way down to the carburetor. And the way that I do that is there's a wing nut on the clamp that attaches the hose to the carburetor, the gas line. So what we do is we loosen that up and pull the hose off the carburetor, verify that there's fuel coming out, and immediately put it back on again. And the next thing we're going to do is inspect the steam condenser. And it's old, and it should be quite safe because there's no pressure buildup in here. But I just look around to make sure that I don't see any fluid coming out of it, and there shouldn't be. This is a steam condenser and not a radiator, so steam comes up into here and then condenses and goes back to water and falls. This little pipe that's down low is really important. This is the steam vent, and the way that I make sure that there are no dirt dauber nests in here, which is not a wonderful thing to do, but you get down in the ground and you have to blow in this hole while this cap is off. And when I blow on that hole, on that pipe, you'll hear air come out, and that means there's no bug nests inside of this hose. This hose is where this extra steam comes out. That's a really, really, really important safety check, because if that stopped up, you could have, the steam condenser could fail and maybe even blow up. All of these controls and many of the brake components are held in place by Carter pins. So the most important thing is I put in oversized Carter pins on the brakes, so it's almost impossible for them to come loose, but check them all. These Carter pins, if they fail, the things that they're connected to can come loose and damage the car or cause it to derail or hurt you. So check all the brake Carter pins. The most important Carter pins are up here in the engine, and these levers push rods, and they move those different mechanisms. But if you have a Carter pin that fails, it could be very dangerous. So I check the Carter pins every time I start the engine, and there's several of them, and you'll see them when you go to start the engine. The the air filter is an oil air filter. And at one time I put a piece of foam around it, like that are using lawnmowers, and the mice or rats got to it. So this thing, it should be taken off, cleaned with gasoline, let it dry, and then it's ready for the next trip. And then just put oil on a rag, any kind of oil, and soak this outside surface, because that's what catches the dust and the dirt from going into the engine. First thing on a pre-start is to reach down under the carburetor against the crankcase and make sure that the crank drain valve is closed. Next thing we're going to check is to make sure the wire that goes to the choke is in place and it's not going to fall off. So I'm going to disconnect the spark plug from the wire from the engine, and I'm going to attach another spark plug and set it up here on top of the water reservoir. And we're going to put the flywheel into the top dead center position, which is there's a white painted mark right here on the flywheel. We're going to set the timer to the mid position back here and turn on the ignition. And also we're going to connect the battery. And we should have spark in the spark plug. Let me turn it so your camera will see it. Maybe. Next thing we're going to check is the dwell. And the dwell means how long the points make contact, what percentage of the time do they make contact as the engine turns around. So it should stay on. I do it with my hand. When I move the flywheel, eventually it will shut off the points. And I'll demonstrate that now. So if I move the flywheel a little bit more, and now it's not making the points close anymore. And if you go this way, it turns back on again until it turns off someplace over here. That angle is called the dwell angle. That's what percentage of the time is the points making contact as the wheel turns around. And it's important that it's plus or minus about 4 or 5 inches. So here's the thing lined up kind of to the center of the car, and I'll put my hand here, and I'm watching this white mark, see when it turns off. So I went beyond my hand about 2 fingers. I'm going to put it back to the center again, put my hand on here where this mark is, and move it this way. It went about my hand and 2 fingers. So the dwell is the points stay closed for the same amount of angle, or the same, plus or minus. That's important. If I went this way and switch was on for 2 hands, as an example, that means that when I moved it this way, it would only be on for a fraction of a hand. Now, the reason that's important in a 2-cycle engine, in this particular engine, is because the timer control, has to operate pretty much the same whether the car is going forward or backwards. If this is significantly out of balance, then you won't be able to retard the engine going this way as much as you can retard the engine going that way. If that happens, all you have to do is open the manual and it'll tell you how to set the gap on the points. If the points aren't set to a particular gap, it causes this problem. It'll make it too big, or it can make it offset. So dwell angle is easy to test. We'll just use my hand. I'll demonstrate it again. We'll turn on the timer. After we set the timer to the 0 position over here, I put my hand on here and I rotate the engine till it goes out. So it's about a hand and 2 fingers. Put it back to the middle again. That's about a hand and finger and a half. That's plenty good. Again, just watch out for it being way unbalanced, where it's a very short distance on one side and a long distance on the other, because that will change the way the retard works, going one way versus the other. Okay, so these old buzz coils can never be run with this spark plug wire loose in the engine like this. If you do, it will permanently damage the buzz coil, and it may not ever work. It will never work again. So if you're going to test the buzz coil, we don't do it attached to the spark plug in the engine. We use another spark plug, and we make sure the spark plug is sitting on ground. So the number one way to destroy the buzz coil is to not have this wire connected to a real spark plug. It's not good enough to make a spark gap, because the spark gap is too big for the buzz coil. So the voltage in the buzz coil could build up too much, and it will cause it to destroy the insulator in it. So this test is to verify that the drive belt is loose enough to where we can idle the engine. Here's the drive belt. You can see how I'm pushing on it with my finger. It's reasonably loose, and when the belt is tight, you can hardly move it with your finger. It's important, if you want to be able to idle the engine, to make sure that the engine can spin with the belt being loose. Otherwise, it will burn up the belt when you're idling the engine, because it will be rubbing on the belt somewhere. When you're done running the car for the day, always put the belt tension all the way full, and that'll keep the belt from shrinking, right? For some reason, these belts shrink. So at the end of the day, when you're done with the speeder, make sure you put the drive belt into the full tension position to keep it from shrinking. So what we're going to do before we start the engine, it takes too much effort to get the gas to first flow from the carburetor into the engine. We'd have to crank it many times by hand. So instead of doing that, we're going to pour a little bit of gasoline into the priming bowl. And over here on the engine is the priming bowl, and there's a little cup and a valve. And it's really simple. We'll pour with the valve closed in its up position. We're going to pour a little bit of gasoline into that bowl, and then we open this valve up and let it flow into the engine, and we'll do that 2 times. And that way there's enough gasoline inside the cylinder to do the first firing of the first startup. So one problem with these old engines is the phenomenon known as sneezing. And sneezing means the engine sounds like it sneezes, and what's really happening is that the new gas fumes that are traveling in the bypass port to the engine have ignited before they've gone into the engine. And when that happens, there is a very small explosion that goes off inside the crankcase. And when it does explode, gases will flow through seals, and they will make a sound like a sneeze. That's not good. It can damage the engine. Most importantly, it can damage the poppet valve in the front of the carburetor, the check valve. And those are made out of a brittle plastic material known as Bakelite. If the engine sneezes, it's probably due to hot carbon fibers that are inside the cylinder and the head area, and they're so hot that the new gas coming into the engine ignites them. So there's a cure for that. One is to run the engine at high RPM, not too high because you can damage it. But if you're on the road, if you're driving and it starts sneezing, the best cure for that is to make the mixture more rich, and that will prevent it from sneezing. It's normal for the engine to sneeze every once in a great while, but if it's sneezing a lot, it usually means that you need to make the mixture more rich. Too much sneezing will break the valve in the carburetor, this little valve that's right on the intake side. So this is the buzz box, and when the buzz box doesn't buzz, and after you determine that it has the proper voltages on it, the most likely reason it's not buzzing, you can see this little plate that's moving when I touch it with my finger. And this is breaking points, electric points that are right at the core. You can see a little bump right here on the outside. On the other side of where this bump is a small electric connection or contact. So we're using 600 grit paper or more. You can put the paper in there and sand that point by wiggling it back and forth. Then you can turn the paper over and you can sand the other point. Or you can use folded paper in half and do both at the same time. But the number one reason that this thing fails is because those little points that are underneath here have got oxide on them. And when it's set up properly and the battery is connected and everything's working correctly, I'll demonstrate what it looks like when it is operating. Can you see inside there now? You can see a little spark in there. It is vibrating. Okay, so in this lesson we're going to learn how to start the engine. And during the exercise of this procedure called a bump start, we'll practice a few times with a spark plug rather than starting the engine, because it will make a lot of noise and it'll be hard for the students to hear. First thing we're going to do is pull the spark plug wire off of the engine and put it onto a spare spark plug and set it up on top of the water reservoir. So this particular point in the lesson is to teach how to set the controls to start the engine. The engine isn't actually going to start. Hopefully you'll be able to hear the buzz coil do its buzz, and maybe you can see the spark plug. That's not important. What's important is how do we set our controls. So if we've gone through the regular pre-flight checks and safety checks, and then we've gassed the engine, the only thing left to do is to check the buzz box or buzz coil, and we've done that already. So in order to get a detonation, we need fuel, we need compression, and we need a spark. We check the spark. We've added fuel through the primer, and now it's time to set the controls for the engine once it starts. So I do a chant so that I can remember to do it correctly every time. And my chant is: the belt is off, the brake is on, the controls are set. But I know that the controls is very retarded on the timer and about 1/3 throttle. The next control is, which we'll set only one time, which is the fuel mixture, is to turn the knob clockwise until you feel a restriction and don't over tighten it. Turn this knob out 1.5 turns. With the timer off, we're going to position, this is the top dead center position. When this is high, that means the piston is all the way to the top dead center. We're going to position this to the back of the car, so it's facing the very back of the car. And this is somewhere around the exhaust stroke. So with that position back there, in order to start the engine, we're going to pull this flywheel, and we're going to build up momentum in the flywheel, and my hand is going to come off the flywheel completely before this red mark goes underneath the engine and comes up near the front, where it will set the points to ignite the spark plug. And we're going to quickly demonstrate that without the engine starting by turning on the ignition. And I'm going to pull this just as if I were starting the engine, but as you remember, we have the spark plug wire tied to a spare spark plug. So all I'm going to do is now to listen for it to buzz, and that tells me I did the proper pull. So you never put your hand through the spokes of this flywheel, always just put them on the top like this and give it a pull. And hopefully you heard that buzz just as this red tape came to about this position, and I'll demonstrate that a couple of more times. Turn off the timer before you put your hand in the engine. Verify that the red marks are facing full to the back of the engine, and turn on the timer, the ignition. Put your hand on the flywheel, and I'm going to pull it rapidly, and I'm going to let go of the flywheel, and my hand's going to be back here before the spark plug goes off. And hopefully you heard the buzz. So that buzz would have ignited the fuel mixture in the engine. So this time we're going to hook the wire back on the engine and demonstrate what happens when it starts. All right, so now we're actually going to start the engine. So I'm going to do my safety chant one more time. The belt is off and the brake is on. The controls are set properly. We've already adjusted the fuel mixture control. With the ignition off, we're going to adjust the flywheel so that the top dead center is facing completely to the back of the car. This is the only time I'm reaching into the engine with the timer, with the spark on, and that's to give it that final pull. Never adjust these things, this engine position, with the timer on. That's it. So after the engine starts, the first thing we're going to do is trying to get it to idle. And the speed of the engine is a function of where the timer is, whether it's retarded or slightly less retarded. We never go to the advanced position ever. This is the throttle. This controls how much air and fuel go into the engine through the bypass, and this is the fuel mixtures. This is the ratio of gasoline to air. So once we get done making adjustments, usually we have to give the throttle a little bit of throttle when we first start the engine so that it will keep spinning. We try to adjust these so that it will idle, and after about 3 or 4 minutes of the engine warming up, we'll try to adjust the fuel mixture from 1.5 turns to start it, and then we'll try and close it half a turn, and we'll listen. If the engine speeds up a little bit, then that's a good way. That's a good sign. That means making the engine more lean was the right maneuver. If the engine slows down when we close it a half a turn, that means we've made the engine too lean. So we'll put it back to the 1.5 original turns when we started the engine. I'm going to close these as if we were riding. Close this for me. I got it.
Good.
Can you hear me okay, you think? So once we get the engine started, it's never going to idle really smooth, but you just want to make sure it's spinning enough to where it doesn't stop. If you close the throttle, you can hear the engine slow down. If you advance the throttle, you can hear it speed back up again. So the throttle has a lot of control over the speed. The timer pretty much will stay back plus about 20%, something like that. Now the next thing I'm going to do is verify whether the mixture is right. So I'll close the mixture a half a turn. You can hear the engine slow down, that means it doesn't want to be leaner. And I'll try turning the mixture a half a turn out, and you can hear it slow down a little bit. So the engine is happy at about 1.5 turns. The next thing we're going to do is take off and start rolling, but I'm going to leave the brake on so we don't actually move. And what we'll do is with basically one finger's pressure, with the pressure of just one finger, you will hear the engines go under load as if it were rolling down the track. And you'll also hear it start firing every cycle. Hear it? And if I push a little harder, we would start rolling down the track. So the belt tensioner is sort of like a clutch in a car. And to step on the clutch, this is where you stepped on the clutch going this way. And when you take the foot off of your clutch, that would be when you're putting it under tension. And you can hear the engine going under load. So I'll demonstrate it one more time in reality. Here it goes, and I'm going to leave the camera's position. Bye-bye. We'll do this startup one more time. So the engine's idling. It's a little faster than idling. I give it a little bit of throttle, take the brake off, and then the very little tension. Oop, we're going a little too slow. With the very little tension on this lever, this is the belt tension, and slowly put pressure on it. And away we go. Now we're going to demonstrate reversing the engine direction. Right now the engine is spinning for the car to go forward this way. And to reverse the direction of the engine, we're going to turn it off, change the timer position, wait, and then turn the ignition back on now. And now the flywheel is spinning to make the car goes backwards. I'll demonstrate that one more time. We're going to turn off the ignition, reverse the timer, wait, and then turn on the ignition. And now the wheel is spinning, going this direction. One more time. Timer off. Ignition off, timer back. That's that. So now when we drive the car, we're going to be driving it from the back direction. And these levers are going to work in this together this time. So more power is this way for both of them. Before it was opposite. We'll take the brake off. And we're going to pull on the tension for the belt. One finger is all it takes. Try and take it slow around these switches. I need now what I'm trying to do is not let the speed get away with us right now. It's firing every cycle. And I'm going to change the fuel mixture a little bit. I'm making it more lean. If you see something on the track, you can stop this thing in a hurry. You don't have to mess with the engine controls or anything. You just grab the brake and stop it. The brake will overpower. There you go. That's a good derailer right there if there ever was one. This thing was just made to derail you, you know, or flip you over. So there was an emergency stop. I didn't touch any controls. I just hit the brake, and the brake is so powerful that it overrode the engine. Well, what I'm trying to do is to get it to fire every stroke. So I'm playing with the timer and the throttle. And we got another obstacle up here.
Okay.
I'll show you guys it reversing.
Yes. You're going to want to change the direction of
the... Just the fingers, because we're going to be going downhill. Since we're going downhill, we can shut the engine off.
Why wheel still spinning as we're moving?
The belt should be loose enough where it doesn't. Like if I turn on the ignition, see it doesn't start. You take the belt tensioner and give it a little pull, and then and you start it up. So, since we're mostly going downhill, we don't need a lot of power. And when we're going in this direction, these controls go together. The throttle and the timer. Going fast downhill is a bad idea. I've derailed this thing 3 times. And it's pretty scary.